The Grand Hall of the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa had been polished for weeks in preparation, but no one could have anticipated the electricity that now pulsed through its veins. The chandeliers, imported decades earlier from Europe, gleamed like suspended suns above rows of polished wooden desks. Flags of every member nation lined the chamber walls, their colors converging into a vast tapestry of history, aspiration, and unfinished promises. Outside, journalists pressed against barriers, their cameras and microphones poised like weapons ready to capture the slightest tremor of news. Inside, the murmur of diplomats was a living current, rising and falling in tides. Delegates from Asia, Europe, the Americas, and the Middle East filled the guest rows, their faces a mix of curiosity, calculation, and quiet anxiety. This was supposed to be a day devoted to economic partnerships, infrastructure discussions, and shared visions of development. Yet every whisper seemed to circle back to two names: Benjamin Netanyahu and Ibrahim Traoré. At the center of the stage, separated by a polished mahogany table that stretched between them, like a symbolic line of contest, sat the two men. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, leaned forward slightly in his seat. His suit was impeccably tailored, the navy blue fabric pressed to perfection. His hair, silvered with the years, was combed neatly, and his gaze radiated the sharpness of a man seasoned in decades of political battles. He had survived wars, elections, scandals, and shifting alliances, and in his posture there was the unmistakable poise of one who believed control was his natural element. Opposite him sat Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. His rise to power had unsettled old patterns. His military background and fiery convictions had already drawn both admiration and criticism across the continent and beyond. He did not wear the polish of decades in international politics, but what he lacked in political seniority he more than compensated for with conviction. His presence carried a gravity that did not rely on carefully rehearsed gestures. It was the weight of someone who believed utterly in what he was saying. The air between them was already charged before a word had been spoken. Netanyahu was the first to break the silence. His voice, amplified by the microphone but sharpened further by the silence of the room, carried across the hall like the crack of a gavel. "We control the future," he said, each word deliberate, his gaze sweeping slowly across the sea of faces in front of him. The sentence was deceptively simple, but its resonance was undeniable. It was not merely a claim. It was a declaration of hierarchy. The weight of alliances, military power, and economic leverage pulsed beneath the words like an undertow. Delegates shifted in their seats. Some scribbled notes, others raised their brows, while Western envoys leaned back with the faintest traces of approval in their expressions. For a brief, suspended moment, no one moved. The air seemed to thicken, and even the chandeliers appeared to burn brighter, as if reflecting the intensity of the claim. Traoré, however, remained motionless. His expression was steady, neither betraying intimidation nor forced composure. He let the silence stretch, just long enough for Netanyahu's words to echo in the minds of the delegates before he leaned slightly into his microphone. "Not our future," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. The reply landed with a force that far exceeded its volume. It was not shouted, not dramatic in delivery, but it struck the chamber like a hammer against stone. Delegates who had been scribbling stopped mid-word. Several exchanged sharp glances. The African bloc of leaders shifted in their seats, some straightening with quiet pride, others wary of the audacity in the face of global scrutiny. The clash had begun. Netanyahu's brow furrowed, though the movement was subtle. Within seconds, he masked it with a faint smile, one that hovered on the line between condescension and composure. The cameras caught every flicker, every micro-expression, broadcasting them live to millions of viewers across the world. The moderators, seated at either end of the stage, exchanged uneasy glances. They had prepared for policy statements, not ideological combat. Yet already the summit had transformed. What had been scheduled as a discussion on trade and infrastructure was spiraling into something far more volatile, a contest over the very narrative of power. President Traoré, Netanyahu began again, this time with the careful civility of a practiced statesman. His hands folded neatly on the table as he leaned back in his chair. Africa's progress has always been linked to the stability and support offered by nations like mine. History proves it, and the future will too. His voice dropped ever so slightly on the final phrase, allowing it to linger in the air like a quiet claim of ownership. The insinuation was unmistakable. Africa's future, its growth, its development, its very place in the world, was, in Netanyahu's framing, tethered to external power. Some African delegates exchanged muted looks, their lips tightening. The subtle condescension was clear. even if wrapped in diplomatic phrasing. Traoré reached for his glass of water, lifting it with deliberate calmness. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Netanyahu's. There was no hostility in his gaze, no visible anger, only a steadiness that radiated defiance without the need for theatrics. He set the glass back on the table and leaned into the microphone. History, he said evenly, also shows what happens when nations believe the future belongs to them alone. It becomes smaller, poorer, and serves only the few. Our future will not be written in another capital. It will be written in the soil of our own land, by the hands of our own people. The ripple was immediate. Murmurs spread through the hall like a wave. Several African leaders nodded, their expressions betraying approval despite the cameras. Others remained rigid, unwilling to risk open endorsement. Western diplomats scribbled furiously, aware that these words were already carving themselves into the narrative of the summit. Netanyahu's smile thinned. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a sharper edge beneath its measured tone. That sounds noble, he said. But nobility doesn't keep nations fed. Strength does. And alliances with the right partners are strength. His words were delivered with the precision of someone who had long practiced the art of framing necessity as inevitability. Traoré leaned forward slightly, his posture shrinking the space across the table without moving an inch from his seat. His reply came steady, almost deceptively quiet. Strength, he said, is knowing you can stand without being held up. The silence that followed was dense, almost suffocating. Even the photographers, who had been clicking incessantly, seemed to hesitate, their shutters slowing as though unwilling to interrupt the gravity of the exchange. The moderators shifted uneasily, attempting to redirect the conversation back to trade and infrastructure. But the attempt was futile. The hall was no longer a forum of cooperation. It had become an arena. Netanyahu's jaw flexed slightly as he clasped his hands together. His tone was deliberate, his words carefully crafted to sound both cautionary and commanding. President Traoré, I admire your ambition. But let me be clear. When the world's great powers align, there are only two choices: join them or be swept aside. The remark landed like a veiled threat, and its implication was not lost on a room. Western envoys exchanged faint smirks. African delegates shifted uncomfortably, some narrowing their eyes. Cameras zoomed in on Traoré, broadcasting his every expression to living rooms around the globe. Traoré did not flinch. His eyes remained locked on Netanyahu's, not in aggression, but in unshaken steadiness, as though weighing the words not for truth but for arrogance. When he spoke, his reply was calm, almost quiet, yet it carried across the hall with unmistakable clarity. And when great powers believe they can sweep aside the rest, he said, they forget that the earth belongs to everyone. Sweep too hard, and you'll find the ground itself rising against you. A low hum of whispers spread across the chamber. The metaphor was not lost on anyone. Some African leaders exchanged subtle nods, their expressions caught between pride and caution. Others kept their faces impassive, unwilling to show alignment in the presence of global cameras. Netanyahu's fingers tapped lightly against the table, a rhythm betraying irritation masked by calculation. Strong words, he replied at last, his tone dipping into patronization. But the future isn't shaped by speeches. It's shaped by those who can act. Traoré leaned back, his lips curving into the faintest suggestion of a smile. Then watch closely, he said, because our actions have already begun. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. The hall was no longer an assembly of polite diplomacy. It was a chessboard, each sentence a calculated move, each silence a test of nerve. Delegates leaned in, some pretending to scroll through documents, others openly staring. The moderators, their notes forgotten, sat frozen. And across the long mahogany table, the two men, one seasoned by decades of global politics, the other carrying the defiant weight of a new generation, locked eyes in a clash that had only just begun. The cameras flashed, capturing not just the faces but the very moment when the summit ceased to be a discussion and became a battle of visions. This was no longer about trade. It was no longer about partnerships. It was about power itself, and everyone in the hall knew it. The atmosphere inside the Jerusalem conference hall had shifted from tense anticipation to something darker, more volatile, like a storm gathering behind closed doors. Cameras captured every movement, every fleeting glance between the two figures at the center of the world's attention: Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the revolutionary soldier from Burkina Faso, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the seasoned Israeli prime minister, whose very presence radiated decades of survival in politics and power. What had begun as a ceremonial dialogue on security and stability in a changing world had become a battlefield of words, heavy with history, blood, and betrayal. The crowd, composed of diplomats, journalists, military advisors, and intelligence operatives, sensed that this was no ordinary exchange. Something irreversible was being forged here. Netanyahu leaned forward, his voice steady but edged with the confidence of someone who believed he had endured far greater challenges. Netanyahu, Captain Traoré, your rhetoric may inspire young men in Ouagadougou, but here in Jerusalem, words carry consequences. You speak of justice, yet you do not understand the price nations pay for survival. Israel exists because we defend ourselves, always and at any cost. The hall quieted, cameras zooming in. Netanyahu's face hardened like carved stone. Traoré did not flinch. His voice, deep and resonant, seemed to cut through the weight of centuries. Traoré, and at what cost, Prime Minister? Entire generations of Palestinians live without land, without dignity, without hope. You speak of survival, but what you practice is domination. What is the difference between security and oppression? When the oppressed are buried under rubble, when the children of Gaza breathe dust instead of freedom. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some journalists scribbled furiously. Others lifted their phones to capture the moment. Knowing history was unfolding live. Netanyahu's eyes narrowed. He was used to critics, activists, NGOs, even heads of state. But this was different. Traoré spoke with the raw authority of someone who had risked his life for his country, not from polished diplomatic chambers but from the battlefront of insurgencies and poverty. Netanyahu, spare me the lectures. Your country is a fragile state held together by force. Burkina Faso struggles with terrorism, coups, and instability. Israel cannot afford your idealism. We live in a region where weakness invites annihilation. You want to know the cost? Look at our cemeteries. Look at our history. We learned long ago that no one will defend us but ourselves. Traoré, and so you justify everything? Every missile, every blockade, every demolished home? Survival does not absolve you of responsibility. If power becomes its own excuse, then you are no longer defending your people. You are condemning them to a future of endless war. The silence between them became unbearable. The tension felt like iron chains tightening around the room. The moderator, a European diplomat caught between fear and fascination, attempted to intervene. Moderator, perhaps we should redirect. But his voice was drowned out as Netanyahu and Traoré continued, their words colliding like weapons. Netanyahu, do not pretend to know the weight of responsibility. Israel is surrounded by enemies. Every concession we make is repaid with rockets. We build walls because without them, we bury our children. Tell me, Captain, if Burkina Faso were under daily attack, would you stand idle? Would you choose weakness over defense? Traoré leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. Traoré, I would choose justice, Prime Minister, because injustice breeds resistance, because occupation breeds rage, and because no wall in history has ever stood forever. Empires fall not from weakness, but from the lies they tell themselves. You can silence a generation with force, but you cannot kill the idea of freedom. The audience gasped. Netanyahu's jaw tightened. He shifted in his chair, not from discomfort, but from the realization that this confrontation was slipping beyond his control. He had expected criticism, not a full-scale ideological assault broadcast across the globe. Suddenly, a voice rang out from the audience, a Palestinian academic, his face weary with years of exile. Audience member, he is right. Justice cannot be bombed into silence. Security moved swiftly, ready to remove the man, but Traoré raised a hand. Traoré, let him speak. The man continued, his voice trembling but resolute. Audience member, for decades, we have been numbers in the news, bodies in statistics. But today, someone stands here and speaks truth. Prime Minister Netanyahu, you can dismiss us, but the world is listening. The world is watching. The intervention electrified the hall. Dozens of cameras pivoted from the stage to the man, then back to Traoré and Netanyahu. Netanyahu responded, his tone colder, sharper. Netanyahu, this is precisely the danger, outsiders emboldening chaos, turning diplomacy into spectacle. Captain Traoré, do you realize what you've done? You've given false hope to people who will only suffer more for it. Hope without power is cruelty. Traoré rose to his feet, his military uniform glowing under the harsh lights. Traoré, and cruelty with power is tyranny. Do not mistake my words for spectacle. They are a warning that no nation, no leader, no empire can escape accountability forever. Not even Israel. Not even you. Gasps echoed across the hall. The moderator looked pale. Security exchanged nervous glances. The cameras continued rolling, every second feeding the world outside. The confrontation was no longer just a debate, it was a reckoning. One carried live into homes, offices, and streets across continents. And beyond the walls of the conference, the streets of Jerusalem stirred. Crowds had gathered outside, some waving Israeli flags, others carrying Palestinian banners. Chants clashed, slogans collided, and the city's ancient stones seemed to tremble under the weight of history repeating itself. Inside, Netanyahu's advisors whispered urgently in his ear. He brushed them aside, his focus locked on Traoré. Netanyahu, you speak as though you are a prophet. But prophets do not build nations. Prophets do not bury their dead after every failed experiment in utopia. Israel is not a metaphor, it is reality. And reality does not forgive weakness. Traoré's reply came like the strike of a hammer. Traoré, reality does not forgive arrogance either. Remember this, the oppressed always outlast the oppressors. History's cemeteries are full of the powerful who believe themselves eternal. The hall erupted, not in applause, not in outrage, but in a collective, stunned silence. And in that silence, the seeds of something larger were planted. Seeds of revolt. Seeds of reckoning. Seeds that neither Netanyahu nor Traoré could fully control. The camera zoomed out, catching both men, one rooted in the old order, the other rising as its fiercest critic. The clash was no longer just between two leaders. It was between two visions of the world. And the night was far from over. The silence inside the chamber was no longer neutral. It was suffocating. Every spectator, journalist, and diplomat present could sense it, the culmination of two irreconcilable forces colliding. Under the brutal glare of the world's cameras, Netanyahu, his jaw tight, leaned forward as if the weight of Israel's entire political machine was pressing down on his shoulders. Traoré, unwavering, seemed to draw strength not from the trappings of power, but from something rawer, something deeper, an unbreakable belief that history itself was watching. You speak of survival, Traoré's voice rang out, not with anger but with the gravity of judgment. But survival built on the ashes of children, on the endless demolition of homes, on walls of concrete and iron. It is not survival. It is suffocation disguised as necessity. And the world is tired of your disguise. A murmur swept across the audience. Even diplomats who had once been trained to hold their expressions in check shifted uneasily. Netanyahu's hands pressed into the table, knuckles whitening, but his reply was swift and sharp. And you, Traoré, he snapped. Lecture me as if Burkina Faso has not been a battlefield of instability, coups, and bloodshed. Who are you to stand here, as though the Sahel is a model of peace? You govern chaos, and yet you pretend to offer morality to a state that has stood for 75 years in the midst of enemies. The words were meant to wound, to expose, to diminish. Yet Traoré did not flinch. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, his gaze cutting like a blade. Yes, he admitted, my nation struggles. But our struggle is ours. We do not bomb children in another land and call it security. We do not cage entire people and call it democracy. My nation's wounds are scars of our own making. But yours are inflicted on a people who did not choose you, who did not invite you, and who still resist you. The chamber seemed to freeze. For a brief moment, Netanyahu's lips parted, but no words came. Cameras zoomed in, catching every flicker of expression, every twitch of discomfort. Then, like a man who had realized silence was more dangerous than words, Netanyahu fired back. You simplify what you cannot understand. Gaza is not a victim. It is a breeding ground of terror. Hamas hides behind its civilians. What would you do if rockets rained on Ouagadougou? What would you do if your neighbors demanded your destruction every single day? Traoré rose to his feet. The motion was not violent, yet it carried the force of a storm. His voice thundered, not only across the chamber but into the living rooms of millions, watching around the world. I would not make my neighbor's child pay the price for my enemy's crime. He declared, I would not flatten entire neighborhoods to silence a handful of men. You justify collective punishment with words like defense. But history hears the screams, not the excuses. For a moment, the clash of applause and outrage broke the chamber into two halves. Some stood and clapped. Others shouted angrily, faces red with indignation. The debate had transcended politics. It had become a mirror, forcing everyone to see their own stance reflected back at them. Netanyahu, sensing control slipping, leaned closer to his microphone. His voice carried the sharpness of a man backed into a corner. You are naive, Traoré. The world does not bend to idealism. Power decides. And power, whether you like it or not, is what Israel has. We will not apologize for surviving. Traoré's reply was almost a whisper, but it cut deeper than any shout. And yet, every empire that spoke those same words has fallen. Power without justice is a sandcastle in the tide. The line struck like a bell, resonating long after it was spoken. Even Netanyahu, for all his practiced rhetoric, seemed momentarily stripped of reply. He sat back, lips pressed together, eyes narrowing, not in triumph, but in calculation. A moderator attempted to intervene, voice shaking. "Gentlemen, perhaps." But the audience drowned him out. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed like lightning. And in the center of it all stood Traoré and Netanyahu. Two men embodying two narratives. Two moral visions. Two versions of history colliding in real time. Slowly, Traoré turned from the table and faced the audience directly, breaking the unspoken rule of debate. "This is not about Netanyahu and Traoré," he said, voice steady. "It is about a world that must choose between silence and truth. Too long have leaders traded excuses while lives vanish. Too long has suffering been reduced to statistics. If my voice trembles the halls of power tonight, let it be known, silence is complicity." The words landed with a finality that no rebuttal could undo. The chamber was no longer just a stage, it was a battlefield of conscience. Netanyahu straightened his tie, forced a thin smile, and muttered into his microphone, "History will judge us both." Traoré's eyes did not waver. "Yes," he answered. "It already is." The broadcast ended, not with resolution, but with the raw tension of a world forced to confront itself. Outside, protests erupted, some in support of Traoré, others defending Netanyahu. Social media exploded with clips, memes, condemnations, and praise. But in the quiet after the storm, one truth was undeniable: something had shifted. The narrative of power, long dominated by the same voices, now had a challenger whose words burned like fire across continents. And though the debate was over, its echo lingered, in the streets of Gaza, in the corridors of Jerusalem, in the dusty avenues of Ouagadougou, and in every corner of a world wrestling with the question: justice or survival? Must humanity choose between the two? The chamber doors closed. The lights dimmed. But history had already marked the night.